It all started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a soft whisper in the wind. Janet had never been one to believe in things like intuition or supernatural connections, but as the days went by, she began to wonder if there was something beyond what she could see with her own eyes, something deeper, something unspoken. It wasn't just that Jake, her golden retriever, had always been attentive, always by her side. No, it was more than that. It was as if he could sense when things were off in a way that no one, not even Janet herself, could understand at first. It was as if Jake knew something she didn't, something about her body that no one had told her yet. He began with small, odd moments. There was the time she had been feeling unusually fatigued, more so than she could ever remember after a long day at work. She chalked it up to the stress of her busy life, the endless meetings and deadlines that never seemed to stop. But that night, as she sank into the couch, feeling like she could barely keep her eyes open, Jake had been unusually quiet. Instead of his usual boundless energy, he stayed close by, sitting at her feet, never taking his eyes off her. It wasn't the playful nudge she had grown accustomed to, asking for attention or a treat. No, this was different. He seemed to be waiting, watching, as though sensing something was wrong. The next day, Janet had gone about her routine, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But it wasn't until a few days later, when the fatigue intensified and she began to notice an odd pain in her abdomen, that she started to consider the possibility that something more serious might be happening. After a visit to the doctor, the diagnosis was confirmed. She had cancer. Yes, the words echoed in her mind, the weight of them pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. But even as the shock and fear set in, she couldn't help but think back to those moments with Jake. Had he known before anyone else? As the days turned into weeks, Janet began to notice Jake's behavior more closely. It wasn't just that he stayed by her side during her treatments, his comforting presence a constant in her life. It was the way he would act, almost as if he were alert to the changes happening inside her. He would sit patiently by her side, his ears perked, his eyes fixed on her, as if waiting for her to acknowledge something he already knew. And then there were the moments when he would nudge her, his nose gently pressing against her hand or leg, as though urging her to listen, to pay attention to what was happening within her body. Janet hadn't known it at the time, but what Jake was sensing wasn't just the emotional turmoil that came with her diagnosis. He was sensing the changes in her body, the physical manifestations of the cancer itself. As the weeks went on, Janet found herself becoming more attuned to Jake's behavior. She noticed that when her symptoms worsened or when her body was struggling to keep up with the treatments, Jake's reactions grew more intense. His nose would nudge her in a way that seemed more insistent, more urgent, as if he were trying to tell her something important. At times, he would jump up onto the bed beside her, his body pressing against hers, offering comfort and warmth in a way that seemed so much more than just a dog's attempt to be affectionate. It was as if he was trying to say, "I'm here with you, and I'm trying to help you through this." It wasn't long before Janet began to realize that Jake wasn't just offering comfort. He was offering something more, something that bordered on the mystical. She began to wonder if there was a connection between her illness and his behavior, something beyond the physical realm, something she couldn't quite explain. Could it be possible that Jake was sensing the subtle changes in her body before anyone else did? Could he somehow detect the cancer in a way that science had yet to understand? Janet's curiosity only deepened when one particular evening she found herself lying in bed, unable to sleep. The pain in her abdomen had intensified, and her mind was racing with worry. She turned to her side, trying to find a comfortable position, but the discomfort was unbearable. Then, as if on cue, Jake appeared. He padded into the room and climbed up onto the bed, settling beside her. His nose nudged her gently, and for a moment he just sat there, his gaze soft but unwavering. There was no frantic behavior, no jumping or barking to get her attention. Instead, he simply sat, his body pressed against hers, offering a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. Janet closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him beside her, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. It was almost as if Jake was silently telling her that everything would be okay, that they would get through this together. In the following days, Janet began to make a startling realization. It wasn't just that Jake was offering her emotional support during the hardest moments. He was helping her tune into her body in ways she hadn't thought possible. His nudges, his insistence on staying close, seemed to correspond with the times when her symptoms were at their worst. It was as if Jake had become a kind of guardian, alerting her to the changes in her body that she herself hadn't yet recognized. Could it be that he was sensing the cancer not just on an emotional level but on a physical one? Was he truly detecting the shifts in her body before even she knew? The idea was both comforting and unsettling. If Jake, with all his loyalty and instinct, could detect something as profound as cancer, it felt like a sign that perhaps there was a deeper bond between them than she had ever realized. It was a bond rooted not just in love and companionship, but in something more primal, something that connected them on a level beyond the ordinary. As the days turned into months and her treatment continued, Janet began to rely more and more on Jake's presence. It wasn't just that he provided solace in times of fear and uncertainty. It was that, in his own quiet way, Jake had become her guide, her reminder to listen not just to the doctors and the tests, but to the subtler signals her body was sending her. End of section 10. And in those quiet moments, when the world seemed too heavy to bear, Janet realized that Jake was more than just a dog. He was her partner in this fight, a partner who had known, long before anyone else, what she was facing. It was an ordinary afternoon when Janet first realized how much Jake's behavior had changed, but something about that day felt different. She could sense a shift in the air, a quiet anticipation that she couldn't quite place. Jake, her Labrador, had always been a calm, loving presence, and his routine was as predictable as the sun setting each evening. But today, he was restless. He paced back and forth in front of her, eyes locked on hers, his nose twitching as if he were trying to decipher some invisible code. His actions were subtle at first, a nudge here, a quick sniff there. But there was an intensity in his behavior that she hadn't seen before. Janet had always known Jake to be a sensitive dog, deeply in tune with her moods and emotions. But this wasn't just about a need for attention or affection. It felt urgent, almost as though Jake was trying to communicate something important, something beyond what words could explain. She had heard rumors of dogs being able to sense things, sickness, sadness, even a person's mood. But this felt different. There was a clarity in his actions, an undeniable persistence that made Janet pause. She had always trusted her instincts, but now, for the first time, she felt something deep within her own body that mirrored Jake's restlessness, a growing unease. It wasn't long before she began to notice that Jake's behavior was increasingly focused on one area in particular: her chest. For the past few days, he'd been sniffing her chest with greater attention than usual. It was as though he could sense something beneath her skin, something she wasn't even aware of yet. Janet shook off the initial discomfort of these strange interactions. She had been through so much in her fight with cancer already: surgeries, treatments, the exhausting cycle of tests and scans, that it seemed impossible to think that her body was at risk again. Yet the more she observed Jake, the more she wondered, could he be picking up on something her body hadn't yet signaled to her? Could he be trying to tell her something? It was the fatigue that did it. That afternoon, Janet felt an overwhelming exhaustion sweep over her, something that went beyond her usual tiredness. She had been dealing with chemotherapy and its toll on her energy for months, but this was different. This was a weight that clung to her, sapping her strength and leaving her feeling weak in a way that didn't make sense. Her mind, ever the skeptic, tried to convince her that it was just another bad day, but deep down, something didn't feel right. And then there was Jake, staring at her with those knowing eyes, not letting her out of his sight. After a restless night, she woke up to find Jake lying beside her, his head resting on her chest, his ear twitching at the slightest sound. It was as if he were trying to guard her, to protect her from something unseen. That morning, his behavior took on a new intensity. He pawed at her chest, sniffing it repeatedly, his nose nuzzling against her as if he were trying to uncover a hidden truth. It was almost as if Jake knew something she didn't, and suddenly Janet realized she had to listen to him. She had to trust what he was trying to tell her. She called her doctor and explained what had been happening. She didn't know exactly what she was feeling, but something inside her told her that Jake was on to something. It wasn't easy to explain the sudden change in her body or Jake's strange behavior, but after a brief conversation, her doctor agreed to schedule a more thorough checkup, suspecting that something might be amiss. The doctor had always known about Jake's role as a companion animal, but this was different. It wasn't just about emotional support. Jake had become a silent sentinel in Janet's battle against cancer, and she couldn't ignore his persistence any longer. When the results came in, they were not what Janet had hoped for. The cancer had returned. The tumor, though small, had started growing again, and it was in a place that was difficult to reach. Janet was stunned. How could she not have known? How could she have missed the warning signs? But as she sat there processing the news, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had caught it early, and as she looked down at Jake, lying at her feet with his head resting gently on her lap, she realized that she owed him more than just gratitude. She owed him her life. The doctors explained that if the cancer had gone undetected for even a few more months, the situation could have been far worse. Janet had always trusted her medical team, but there was something about Jake's intuitive behavior that added a layer of certainty to her path. He had been the one to detect it first, long before any medical scans or tests could confirm it. There was no denying that Jake had been a silent guardian, warning her of the danger before she had even felt it. As the days passed, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that Jake had become more than just a dog. He was her partner in this fight, a partner who understood her in ways no one else could. Jake's behavior, once dismissed as mere affection, had evolved into a remarkable form of detection. He had a way of sensing when things weren't right in her body, an ability that, while mysterious, was undeniably effective. She looked outside. Her husband was climbing into the cab when he saw her, surprised and smiling. With Jake by her side, Janet knew she wasn't facing this battle alone. She could trust him when he told her something was wrong, even if she didn't fully understand it. He had proven that his instincts were more reliable than any test, any scan, or any doctor's visit. The bond they shared had deepened into something sacred, something that went beyond the ordinary. And as she looked at Jake, his brown eyes filled with affection, Janet knew that he would continue to be her constant companion, her silent protector, guiding her through whatever challenges lay ahead. It wasn't just that Jake could detect when something was physically wrong with Janet, it was the way he seemed to understand her in ways no one else could. As time went on, the connection between them deepened, far beyond the usual bonds of pet and owner. There were days when Janet would sit on the couch, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she was dealing with, and without a word, Jake would jump up beside her, resting his head in her lap, offering comfort without asking anything in return. It was as if he could sense her fear, her exhaustion, her moments of quiet despair. In those moments when everything felt too heavy, Jake became her rock, her silent partner in this battle for survival. The strange thing about Jake's alerts was that they were never just about his instinctual ability to detect cancer. Over time, Janet came to realize that his presence and his actions were not only a physical response to changes in her body, but also a psychological lifeline. His alerts were just as much emotional as they were biological. It was as if he understood not just that something was wrong, but that she needed him to help her find the strength to face it. There were days when she wasn't sure she could continue, when the thought of more treatments, more scans, and the constant looming presence of cancer threatened to break her. But then there was Jake. who, without fail, would be there to nudge her, to nuzzle her, to sit beside her and let her feel that she wasn't facing this alone. It was on one particularly difficult day that the true depth of their bond became clear. Janet had just received news from her oncologist that the cancer had spread further than expected. It was another setback, and Janet could feel the familiar wave of despair creeping in. She stood in her living room, staring at the phone in her hand, unsure of how to process the information, unsure of how to move forward. As she stood there, a wave of sadness washed over her, and she felt the crushing weight of it all. But then, as though on cue, she felt a gentle nudge against her leg. She looked down to see Jake, his eyes fixed on hers, his expression calm, yet insistent. Jake didn't bark or whine. He didn't jump or do anything overt. Instead, he simply pressed his body against her, standing at her side, offering his silent support. She bent down to stroke his fur, and in that moment, she could feel the strength emanating from him. It was a quiet strength, something she couldn't explain, but it was there, like a steady current that grounded her, preventing her from slipping too far into the darkness. She hadn't even realized it, but in his own way, Jake had been preparing her for moments like this. He was teaching her how to stay strong even when everything around her felt uncertain. What struck Janet the most about their bond was how instinctive it all was. Jake didn't need to be trained to comfort her emotionally. It came naturally to him. His ability to sense when she was struggling wasn't something she had to teach him. It was just part of who he was. In many ways, it felt as though they were more than just owner and pet. They were connected on a deeper level, as if their hearts beat in sync, as if his presence alone could ease the pain of her illness. This wasn't just about physical symptoms or medical alerts. This was about a connection that transcended language, a bond that was built on trust, understanding, and unconditional love. On days when the treatments were especially hard, when the side effects left her feeling weak and nauseous, Jake would be there, his quiet presence offering a kind of peace that was hard to find elsewhere. He seemed to know when she needed space and when she needed comfort. There were times when he would lie by her feet, just quietly watching over her, and in those moments, Janet felt a sense of calm wash over her. She would now consider dealing with the sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't that her physical pain went away, but Jake's silent companionship made it more bearable. It was a reminder that no matter how difficult things got, she wasn't facing them alone. It wasn't just during her moments of vulnerability that their bond grew stronger. Even on the good days, when she was feeling more like herself, when the treatments were less taxing, Jake was there, providing a steady source of joy and companionship. Their walks in the park, their quiet moments at home, the way he would gently nudge her hand when he wanted attention. These small, everyday interactions deepened their connection and reminded Janet that she was more than just her illness. She was a person with a dog who loved her, who didn't care about the cancer or the medical challenges she faced. Jake loved her simply because she was her. And that love, in all its simplicity, was a lifeline in a world that often felt overwhelming. As the months went on, their bond only grew stronger. Janet found herself relying more on Jake, not just for comfort, but for strength. He had become her constant, the one thing she could count on when everything else felt uncertain. He was her emotional anchor, the one being who knew her better than anyone else, who understood when she needed a quiet moment, or when she needed to be reminded that there was still hope. And perhaps most importantly, Jake had become her reason to keep fighting. In a life that sometimes felt out of control, he was a reminder that there was still love, still companionship, and still a reason to hold on. It was during one of her doctor visits, after another round of scans and blood tests, when she realized just how far their bond had come. Janet had been given the good news that the cancer had remained stable, that the treatment was working. As she walked out of the office, she felt a deep sense of relief. But it wasn't until she saw Jake waiting for her at home that she realized just how much he had been her rock, He had been there through the darkest moments, offering his quiet, unwavering presence. And in that moment, Janet knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together because their bond was unbreakable, built on love, trust, and the shared understanding that they would never have to walk this path alone. There was a quiet shift that Janet couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the way Jake had become more alert, more present in the most unexpected moments. It was as though he knew, on some level, that their bond had taken on a new depth. At first, she attributed it to the long hours they spent together, her recovering from the side effects of chemotherapy, and him lying loyally beside her, his body a constant source of warmth and comfort. But as the days passed, it became clear that something more was happening between them. It started one evening when Janet, exhausted beyond words from another round of treatments, sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of everything pressing on her chest. The uncertainty, the fear, the constant battle to keep moving forward, it was all too much. She felt as if she had been treading water for far too long, just barely staying afloat. And in the midst of her overwhelming thoughts, there was Jake, appearing by her side as he always did. But tonight, something was different. There was no playful nudge, no paw against her leg for attention. Instead, he simply sat quietly at her feet, his gaze fixed on her with an almost uncanny intensity. Janet looked down at him, her chest tightening as she realized that Jake wasn't just here to provide the usual comfort he always offered. This time, his stillness seemed to carry a weight of understanding, as if he knew exactly what she needed, even before she did. It wasn't just that he was there, it was how he was there. His quiet, unwavering presence seemed to be saying, "I'm with you in this, no matter how difficult it gets." And in that moment, Janet felt something stir inside her, a strange, yet undeniable sense of peace. The following weeks brought more uncertainty, more testing, and more difficult conversations with doctors. The physical toll of the cancer treatments was immense, and some days Janet could barely summon the strength to get out of bed. But there, at every turn, was Jake. He was with her in the mornings, nudging her gently to get up, as if to say, "It's time to face the day." He was with her in the evenings, curling up next to her as the weight of the world seemed to fall on her shoulders. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to offer solutions. He was simply present, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. What surprised her most, however, was the way Jake had begun to intuitively sense when she needed more than just his physical presence. There were times when Janet would retreat into herself, when the pain and exhaustion became too much, and she would find herself sitting in silence, lost in her thoughts. And in those moments, Jake would always know. He would move closer, his nose nudging her hand gently, as if urging her to stop hiding from the emotions she was trying to bury. Sometimes he would rest his head on her lap, staring up at her with those deep, knowing eyes. Other times, he would sit quietly beside her, his body pressed against hers, offering his warmth as a comfort she couldn't find anywhere else. It wasn't always the grand gestures, the moments of obvious support. Sometimes it was the little things that made the biggest difference. One afternoon, when Janet had felt particularly low, overwhelmed by the weight of the endless medical appointments and the constant cycle of treatments, Jake surprised her with something that left her speechless. She had been lying on the couch, her energy drained, when she heard him rummaging around in the kitchen. When she turned to see what he was up to, she watched in quiet amazement as Jake trotted into the living room, a small ball in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet, then looked up at her, tail wagging in that unmistakable, hopeful way. It was such a simple gesture, and yet in that moment it meant everything. Jake wasn't just offering a toy, he was offering a moment of lightness, a reminder that life didn't have to be all about pain and struggle. For a moment, he was showing her that even in the midst of her battle, there could still be joy, still be something to hold on to. With a quiet smile, Janet picked up the ball, and though the fatigue in her body screamed at her to rest, she tossed it across the room. For a brief moment, she wasn't thinking about her illness or the uncertainty of the future. She was simply playing with her dog, reconnecting with a part of herself that felt lost in the chaos. That was the gift Jake had given her. He helped her rediscover the little moments of normalcy that cancer had threatened to steal away. Whether it was through a shared glance, a soft nudge, or an unexpected game of fetch, Jake reminded her that life wasn't just about surviving the fight. It was about finding moments of joy, however fleeting they might be, and somehow, that small act of play, of living in the present, became an anchor for her in the midst of everything else. It became increasingly clear to Janet that Jake wasn't just offering her companionship or emotional support. He had become her guide, her source of strength. In his quiet way, he reminded her that she could still find reasons to smile, reasons to hope, even when the weight of her illness threatened to crush her spirit. His presence was the light in the darkness, the steady hand pulling her back when she started to slip away from the fight. In the end, it wasn't the medical treatments or the advancements in science that made the difference in her recovery. It wasn't even the days spent in the hospital or the hours spent in doctors' offices. It was Jake, his love, his intuition, his ability to know exactly what she needed without her having to say a word. It was all of these things that had kept her going, and as she sat there in the quiet moments, with Jake resting his head on her lap, she realized just how much he had become a part of her healing. With Jake by her side, Janet knew she could face whatever the future held, because she was no longer just fighting cancer. She was fighting it with a loyal companion who would never let her down.